There's not a kind of advisory service for women to step them through as they're progressing through what is often quite traumatic times of their life. To me, if you don't have that basic human right of somewhere safe, then you can't really participate in community life.
Have you ever had to deal with the police or been to court? Have you ever had to seek legal counsel without knowing where to start or how you're supposed to afford it? Regardless of the situation, interactions with the legal system can be extremely stressful. Now imagine it's because of family or domestic violence. At least 2 in 5 police-recorded assaults in 2024 were related to family or domestic violence across all states and territories, excluding Victoria. And 42% of civil cases in the magistrates' courts between 2023 and 24 involved a domestic violence order. Imagine what it must be like for women whose savings are tied up in their partner's finances, including their house, having to flee that partner to find shelter and legal advice, whilst trying to protect themselves and their children. Even when violence isn't involved, divorce or conflict can put women at a high risk of homelessness. Women who divorce later in life often will not own their own home outright, and they won't be able to qualify for a mortgage. And this is a key component that puts them at risk of housing insecurity. I'm Dr. Kate Raynor, the Director of the Centre for Equitable Housing at Capita, and I have been researching Australian housing for over a decade. What could a gender-equal housing system look like? How would we know it if we saw it? That's what we'll find out in Season 2 of Homes Not Houses. On this episode of Homes Not Houses, I'll be taking a look at challenges women face while navigating the legal system and how it compounds the already complex challenge of finding adequate housing. I'll be joined by Jackie Galloway, OAM, CEO of the Peninsula Community Legal Centre. Peninsula Community Legal Centre is an independent, not-for-profit organisation that has been providing free local services to Melbourne's southeastern communities since 1977. Beyond that, she has 25 years of experience advising on policy, rights, and reform in an effort to make Australia a more equitable nation for all.
Thank you, Jackie, so much for your time this morning. I wanted to start with a bit of as personal a question as you want it to be, but a question about you and how you came to be working in this intersection of housing and gender and legal practice. How did you arrive at this point?
Yeah. I suppose it's in both my personal and my professional life. I've kind of experienced the intersect between housing and gender. It's been a constant over my journey. As a sole parent in the 80s, I raised my children, and one of the key themes for me was ensuring I had access to safe, appropriate and affordable housing, and that was always at the front of my thinking as a mum. The loss of the family home was heartbreaking for me. And back then, and unfortunately still today, there was little in the way of financial products or mortgages that was designed for my particular needs, taking into account that my children were really young and, I needed time to retrain myself to be able to build a career and have enough money to sustain a mortgage. And back then in the 80s, we had interest rates of 17%. So it was really, really tough. And it's quite sad, really, because like many of the women that we see at the Legal Centre today, they still don't have access to affordable and secure housing. And to me, if you don't have that basic human right of somewhere safe, then you can't really participate in community life. And that's still a real concern for me. And, when I look at things like, we've still got a gender pay gap and women are earning on average $247 less per week than men. And then I did a bit of research and, according to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, the median pay for women is still 19% less than the median pay for men. How do we compete? It's concerning that even in the largely female-dominated sector that I work in, which is, healthcare and social assistance, it's still reporting 21.4%. So I certainly acknowledge the pay gap's improved, but it's still having an impact for women, the new generation of women now, trying to access appropriate, long-term, secure housing to raise their families. So that's kind of my history as to why I knew back then in the 80s with what I was experiencing that I wanted to kind of work in this space. And probably unbeknown back then, I didn't see myself as leading a community legal centre, but I certainly recognised that for me as a woman, it was just a much harder road for me. I suppose there was still opportunities for aspiration, which is concerning where I kind of see that is lessening today. So there was aspiration there, but there wasn't a lot in the way of support, which I think is still the issue today. There's not a kind of advisory service for women to step them through as they're progressing through what is often quite traumatic times of their life. Women are having to access the lending institutions, mortgage brokers. And I think that's one of the things that I would love to see is women's centres which could look at as they progress through, because often I think is that women are often required to make quite significant life-changing decisions in the midst of when they are at their most vulnerable, often, at times of separation, and then they're being asked to make these kind of long-term solutions.
Yeah, it is upsetting to me the degree to which that story hasn't changed. That was your experience in the 80s, and it's still the experience.
It's still the experience today. And depending on which sector women are working in, for some women, they're leading the way, but for others, we're still a long way behind.
So I wanted to ask you about the Peninsula Community Legal Centre, and you've touched on the fact that women come in when they're going through divorce and there's all that complexity. I'm interested in just broadly the main reasons why you see women come into the legal centre, and what are the kinds of questions they're asking, what are the kinds of needs that they need addressed when they come through the door.
Yeah, so the legal centre's been in operation for, I think we're about 47 years that we've been in operation. 50% of the women, or primarily women, that access PCLC for our whole suite of services report experiencing family violence. So we've, I suppose, had a unique view because we often work with women for a longer period of time, particularly through the family violence and then on to the family law. So we do get to see what are those kind of longer term issues that women face. And I think when I look at the community sector and, our health sector, and it's a bit disjointed and often services have got criteria and guidelines, often based on their funding. So it's not a criticism, it's just the way it is. And often women are having to jump across into different services to meet their needs. And sometimes I think that often supports women falling through the cracks. For most women accessing PCLC, first and foremost, it's about safety. It's about providing duty lawyer services at the court, making sure that we can secure intervention orders and to work with women to ensure that they're being part of the process. Often they can feel like it's all happening around them because once police are involved, they seek the order on their behalf. It's up for us then to be able to work with her to ensure that the order is structured or designed in her best interest and her feeling like she's part of the process. So safety is paramount. Housing is a big consideration in those conversations. So we've historically had a system where it's been about women leaving the relationship, leaving the house. And where there are significant safety concerns, I absolutely agree with that strategy. But I think for a lot of women, they feel like they're being punished, because it's all about them having to leave and start this new life. I'm buoyed by seeing new programs where there's a lot more emphasis on keeping women in their homes where possible, because it has a much greater effect or impact for her and her children moving forward. Divorce and separation is increasingly traumatic. And then having to move suburbs away from their support networks, away from the childcare centre, all of those things that women have to consider as part of their housing, we'd like to see a little bit more of a shift, that people who use violence, they should be the ones that have to move out. So for us, it's about looking at those considerations, looking what's best for her, getting her decisions, getting intervention orders. And then where often the question then comes around the children, and then we might then have to look at how we assist them in the family law space, where we would look at getting orders for residency of the children. We might do urgent recovery orders with our duty lawyer service at the federal court, where often the person who uses violence might, or the other party might decide to take the children without consent, and then we get orders to get them back. We've had recent, 16-week-old baby wasn't returned after contact, and so and taken interstate. So we had to seek orders. That's really scary. We do things like airport watch orders to ensure that children are not taken out of the country. So we do a bit of that safety planning. And then from a real practical level, I have a tenancy program. As you know, a third of the population rent, and increasingly for women, that's where their option is. Our social housing numbers are down in the 3 to 4%.
Yes.
So if you're not in home ownership, social housing is a very limited option. I have to say, we really welcome the big bill and what's happening, but we understand there's 16,000 homes to be built across the country, and that's fantastic. But there's 50,000, so that's 16,000 homes in Victoria, I think, but there's 50,000 on the waiting list.
Oh, yes. So, it's a drop in the ocean.
It's a drop in the ocean. So for us, the private rental market is where the vast majority of the women we see are. And as such, we're really keen. We've had some amazing renting reform, but we need to still be thinking around what's long-term look like for women. If you look at the European countries, it's accepted practice. Renting is long-term.
Yes, and it comes with the rights that allow that to happen.
That's right. It comes with those protective frameworks. It comes with a community narrative where we are still, like if, a tenancy program, 40% of the work we do is preventing evictions. Wow. So right now we've got a lack of supply. We've got vacancy rates in some of our regions as low as 0.9%. So there's no properties, which are driving up the costs of rent. Yes. And so we're seeing, our women and their families struggling to pay the rent. And if the car breaks down, it's like, what do you do? So they're struggling to pay the exorbitant rents. And then we see where we have some rental providers trying to take advantage of this and issuing, really significant rent increases. And ultimately, for some of our clients, they're being served with end of fixed term notices purely for the purposes of trying to secure a higher paying renter. So, women are battling this. So as part of our role as in our tenancy program is to try and do that kind of preventative work. And then across the centre as a whole, we've got, our general kind of civil program, and it's really around looking at the debts and those side issues. Often women experiencing family violence, the person using family violence will have signed them up to all sorts of contracts that they might not be aware of. We see that there are fines using her car. So we do that kind of work around looking at how do we then ensure. We see a lot of women from multicultural backgrounds. Often they're not even on the title of the property. And when we look at legal issues, there's such a broad crossover. If we don't address these issues, then trying to secure housing is, near on impossible.
Yes, and it intersects in so many ways. There's, I guess, the power differential inherent in just the pay gap on its own. And then you add on top of that these cultural elements and then financial abuse and coercive control and aspects like that. And it just continues. I can see how that's happening. I wanted to ask you a question about when separation happens. And we talked about family violence and this change, this shift that's starting to occur around women being more likely to stay in the home and the person using violence more likely to leave. When you look at separation or divorce, Who usually keeps the family home? What do you think is more common? Is it more common that the woman will keep it or that the man will?
No, no. The vast majority of the cases we see is the house gets sold and they
Right.
both have to go, which again is they're largely then going into the rental market. So there's this
Yes.
added pressure on the supply issue. And this is one of the complications of this space is that often at the time of trying to settle these settlements, people are keen to kind of move on, but women are often feeling like they have to make these decisions because we can't afford the mortgage, we're separated, who's going to pay it? And as such, they can make some kind of decisions at the time and then regret those decisions. But yeah, primarily what we see is the vast majority of those we see, and we primarily act for women. We do act for some men, but we primarily act for women just because of the nature of our family violence kind of work. We see that for many of them, the house gets sold. And that's where I'm really keen to, how do we redesign and create products in which the home doesn't have to be sold? Because in my view, once the house is sold, the likelihood of her re-entering the mortgage market is slim.
Yes.
Very slim. And that's what we're sort of starting to experience in our property law work, that it's incredibly difficult for a woman to get a mortgage in her own right. And so for us, it's like, how do we get the policymakers and the banking industries to actually come back, take a step back and look at how we start to think about housing long term, and what does that look like, whether it is home ownership, whether it's renting, whether it's social housing, but to kind of kick back and sort of look at it in its entirety. I was really pleased and buoyed. I'm not sure whether you'd seen it, but Consumer Policy Research and the Mortgage Stress just did their recent report, The Broken Mortgage System. I was really buoyed by that report because I think, and we really endorse their recommendation of an inquiry, because I think in Australia we have a system where it's a variable home loan or it's fixed term, and the fixed terms are often short. That's it. As far as the mortgage market. So to actually start to see that we're getting our concerns out in the marketplace, that fingers crossed, someone listens and starts to think about providing products that reflect today, what's happening today, not based on something that was developed decades ago that is not suiting the needs of the vast majority of our population.
Yeah, and household structures that don't exist anymore and ways of working and being that are no longer relevant. I agree. I was at the launch of that report and it's fantastic. And the recommendations in it are fantastic. And this discussion about the fact that in many other countries in the world, it is really common to have 10, 20-year fixed rate mortgages, and that this just doesn't exist in Australia. I mean, as was the discussion at the launch, we need to be asking why. Because there's no reason we can't have it. It's just that we haven't had the political or the banking will. So yes, I think it's a really good report.
I was just going to say, I was reading some research from Cotality, and they actually revealed a significant shift in attitudes towards property ownership amongst young Australians, particularly young women. And that kind of raised that whole question around home ownership and the Australian dream. I think in their 6th annual Women and Property report, I'll just quote it, they show that property ownership is considered less important by Australian women in both the millennial and Gen Z age groups compared to their male counterparts. They're disengaging because they've lost aspiration. And certainly affordability pressures seem to be the main motivating factor behind that. But for me, that's really scary if our young women are losing that aspiration of home ownership. And home ownership's not the only answer here, but it is concerning if we're shifting away, because we don't actually have a safety framework to back that up. So if you're shifting away from home ownership, you are then looking at a private rental market. And we don't, the narrative in the private rental market, so what we see in our tenancy program, if you're working, you get a 12-month lease. And then generally you go into periodic. If you're on a government benefit, you get a 6-month lease. In, the decades that I've been in this industry, we don't see long-term leases. And while we have leases recognised in our legislation, industry practice don't use them. So again, it's like, how do we start to get a shift of the narrative that if renting is going to be part of the long-term solution for women, then we need to ensure that we've got a framework that provides some sort of surety and predictability, because I think that's what women are looking for. If there's service
that's what
planning,
anyone is looking for.
yeah, you want to know. Like currently, just had a rate rise. We've got another one on the agenda, where the mortgages can go up considerably. How does a woman trying to raise her family do that?
Yeah, I think it's people giving up, right? It's not women saying that this isn't important. This is women saying this is so far beyond the realm of something that I can achieve that it's like saying I'm committed to running 5 kilometers as fast as possible. I'm never going to work to be an Olympian runner. No. Like it's not in the realm of possibility for me, but I can commit to, park run in the morning. I feel like buying a home as a young person on a low income or even a moderate income has become an Olympic sport. It's just outside of the realm. And I understand why people are responding in that way. But if we shift towards renting, but we have a social welfare system that's predicated on home ownership, and home ownership being pretty much the only way you can have a dignified retirement, then it's just a problem that's shifting across a generation. Yeah, and we'll catch it anyway.
It's that disconnect, isn't it? We've got a complete disconnect in this country around long-term housing. And that's where we need to be, we need reviews and inquiries to start to really do, how do we connect the dots? In renting, just getting national principles and, and then trying to work with industry around, well, why? We provide incentives to rental providers, in the form of negative gearing. Why can't we start to work with rental providers about offering longer term leases? Because I think for many, it's not for all, not everyone wants a long-term lease, but I think for older women, and I think for women raising their families, having a predictable period of time where they know that the rent is going up, even getting a good rental formula so they know their rent, because currently the rent can go up based on market. Housing supply problem, bigger rent. And using international models, the CPR research and mortgage stress research, looking at international models, what's working overseas, and how do we as a nation start to think about implementing some of those strategies?
Yeah, which is a nice segue into what we should be thinking about in terms of solutions. And so I wanted to ask you, you mentioned before the Reach Her program. And so I wanted to talk about that. And then maybe after that, a bit of a discussion about different mortgage products and banking and home loans and how that intersects. But first, can you tell me about Reach Her? What's that?
Reach Her is a 3-year pilot program funded by the Victorian Legal Services Board. It's delivered through a partnership between Peninsula Community Legal Centre, Southside Justice and Southeast Community Links. The pilot really aims to integrate support across legal, financial and housing domains, and it's really grounded in lived experience and combines direct support with targeted advocacy to address what we see as the systemic conditions that entrench women's housing and financial insecurity. We've got this vision that women in Victoria have access to safe, secure housing and the opportunity to rebuild their lives free from violence and financial insecurity. We kind of have this approach around delivering that integration between legal, financial and psychosocial support through a culturally responsive and collaborative model alongside advocacy. That's a key component. So what does REACH stand for? So it's recover, supporting women to regain stability and rebuild their lives through coordinated legal and financial assistance. Empower, so we want to build their knowledge, skills and confidence so women can navigate legal and financial systems with greater independence. Advocate, we want to drive systemic change through policy advocacy and engagement with legal, financial and regulatory institutions. We want to collaborate. So we want to work with community organisations, legal services and financial institutions to deliver holistic, tailored support. And then, of course, house. We want to support access to safe, stable and affordable housing through legal advocacy and housing pathways. So as part of our design planning for the project, we undertook a consultation process, and the consultations included one-off interviews and an online focus group with women who had experienced family violence, economic abuse and housing insecurity. And it's just a little quote, "If you can't help me, no one's going to be able to help me." This was how one woman described her experience of seeking support after leaving family violence.
Mm.
Her words kind of do reflect a recurring theme across the consultations. Women are trying to navigate complex legal, financial and housing systems at the time of crisis, experiencing fragmented services, rigid eligibility rules and unclear pathways. And for many women, separation did not mark the end of the harm, but the beginning of a prolonged struggle to secure safety, housing stability and financial independence. And as we know, family violence is a major driver of housing insecurity, with economic abuse playing a central role in limiting women's financial agency and long-term stability. Generally, of a general rule, the free legal assistance sector, so legal aid commissions and CLCs, have traditionally not done a whole lot of work in property settlements. It's simply that we've just never had the funding. This is why Reach Her and, there's another Women's Legal Services also got a project happening where we're starting to see that we need to step into this market. So for women who are going through private lawyers, and of course private lawyers are entitled to be paid, it can be quite costly. Reach Her is really designed to maximise every dollar that we can secure for her in order for her to be able to make informed decisions about where her future lies. It might mean that there's $40,000 or $50,000 in the pool that she's entitled to. It might mean that there's substantially more, but every cent that we can secure where there is no cost to her, that makes it far better for her to be able to make an informed decision. And one of the key things that we identified in the lived experience was that kind of eligibility gap, particularly for women who may be asset, and I don't like the term, but asset rich, but cash poor, or working in low-paid, insecure jobs, leaving them screened out of support despite high risk. And there's a real gap, and we're seeing that coming through Reach Her, where they might have a fairly good entitlement of the property, but they've got no money coming in. So they can't afford, and otherwise what happens is that they're there on these kind of arrangements with private lawyers that it comes out of the settlement, or there might be a caveat put on by, a legal aid commission. So we want to maximise that by for her not to have to pay those costs. And, certainly there's harmful bank and creditor responses that women are reporting, including pressure to sell homes. I think as the CPRC report, there's inconsistent hardship responses that are not necessarily taking into account timeframes for women, what women are going through, and there's limited recognition of the family violence impacts for us. And getting those consultation feedback actually buoyed us in recognising that what we thought when we started this project has really reinforced where we thought. So we know that timing matters, and so we really want to make sure that women have access to legal and financial as early as possible.
Yes.
That integration is absolutely essential. We know our expertise is legal, so we need to be working across that. The information gaps are insignificant, and we need to work on how we can fill those gaps and what's missing, and to be advocating to look at long term. And that we certainly need to look at the cultural and language considerations. Multicultural women are facing those additional barriers, not enough support, particularly in the private sector, in relation to being able to provide information in a culturally sensitive way.
Yes, I can imagine.
So the Reach Her project is really aimed that from the legal element, we do the property settlement for women. The financial counselling service is then looking at any debts, anything that we need to address. And then the next component of the project is that we have a capability worker, and their role is to look at what are the options. Once we know roughly what we think the settlement's going to come in at, and then it's the role of the capability worker to explore, is home ownership possible? If not, exploring all the government schemes, or is it simply the private rental market is where we're going to go?
And I know with that, the discussion about assets, a real challenge is that you can't qualify for social housing if you have over $50,000 in assets.
That's right.
It's such a stressful thing to do to someone, to say you've got $100,000 and you need to, over time, impoverish yourself until you've hit a point where we'll be willing to look after you. And what a missed opportunity to support someone at that point where they had enough of a deposit maybe to do something. But
Exactly.
no, you need to spend it in the private rental sector on expensive rent,
Pay your
and an
rent to a
insecure
private
situation.
operator. And, and I think when I look at, like the fastest growing cohort of homelessness is women 55 plus. And I often question or wonder, and reflect and go, how many of those women went through a separation, often conceding their entitlements or just accepting whatever they could get, and then subsequently use that money to pay their rent, and are now, their children are moved out, their income's reduced, and they're now in real dire situations. And I feel like by doing Reach Her and projects or much more earlier at the time of separation, and again, I think that conversation that we had earlier around where is those advisory services that could be looking long term. And because I think for a lot of women, they don't think what's going to happen when they're 50. They're just so focused on trying to raise their families and day to day, and then all of a sudden find themselves in a housing market that they simply can't afford. And despite being on waiting lists, the waiting list is long and they're not getting in there. So there's some real kind of issues there. And we're really excited about the prospect of the systemic advocacies. The Reach Her is overseen by a steering committee. So we have representatives with expert subject matter expertise. So we've got banking, we've got law, judiciary, and housing on that steering committee. And so we're kind of really super excited about bringing to the fore what we're experiencing. And we're really early in the project. We've had to do all the implementation, but I can say that from the legal perspective, 200 women have been triaged and assessed. I think we're currently got about 55 matters on the go in the legal element. We've settled 11 matters at a monetary value of $2.1 million. 2 women are likely to secure home ownership out of those 11.
Yes.
Which is extraordinary. But on the flip, there's 9 women are unlikely or are not, the home ownership is just not where they're going to be because of issues around whether they could afford a mortgage, and currently battling with an industry that has pretty strict guidelines, and they're not going to fit within that the current marketplace.
Are there any changes to that industry that you'd like to see happen in particular? Are there interventions at that point that would make home ownership easier for women in that situation?
When I look at and reading the broken system, mortgage system report, they showed South Korea. South Korea have 50-year mortgages. So if we had longer mortgages, that would bring the price down. Why is it that international countries are operating with interest rates in the 2s? So that's why, we're endorsing that whole thought pattern of a review, because we need to understand why is it that Australia has the interest rates as they do, and that we've got this rigid process, short fixed term mortgages or variables. So I also think, and credit to the banking industry, there are times in which they will negotiate on behalf of individual clients in their mortgage, but it's an individual thing. Again, we need some guidelines and some commitment from the industry to start to really think about how they could redesign their products. They need to have a look at a woman's future capacity. They need to have a look at, she has caring responsibilities that's going to take her in and out. We've got this gender pay gap issue. I mean, we have to address that. And the other kind of thing that I've touched on, where I think there's some work could be done is around superannuation. Currently, you can't act superannuation for housing. I do, there's kind of mixed views on that. I certainly understand that superannuation is designed for retirement living and your retirement. But it is a concern for me is that for many women, they're going to be impoverished at the time of retirement. I do think there's opportunities to tweak the superannuation system. So part of the work we do in settling property law matters is often a superannuation split, is often getting a percentage of the other party's superannuation. I fail to understand why we can't access that. It's not touching her super, but why that can't be where that could add to the asset pool, which could tip her in the sense of being able to afford a property. Because currently we can't do that. Family Law Act doesn't allow that either. The judiciary absolutely required that they make orders that it goes into her superannuation fund. But again, if there is opportunity to provide some sort of long-term financial security for her in housing, that's ultimately going to help her at retirement. Holding off until, when she's living in poor rental accommodation at time of retirement, that money's not going to make a lot of difference. It could make a huge amount of difference. So again, starting to have a look at, and obviously with Reach Her, we'll start to document kind of how much money that we're securing through superannuation splits.
And would it make a difference?
And could it make a difference? It's not the panacea of solutions, but it's also about opening our minds to looking at different options.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I have historically been very anti supporting people to take money out of their superannuation to pay for housing, because I believe that you're taking away something that's meant to protect you at retirement age, and it's inflationary to give people additional access, particularly if you do it as an umbrella decision rather than a targeted decision. But I think, in that instance particularly where it's not her own superannuation, it's super coming from a separation, I can definitely see that argument. And I can also see how, if we just think from a public health perspective, like the benefits of having access to secure housing as early as possible in a process is going to pay dividends over the course of your life, because we know there's a massive correlation between poor quality housing and housing stress and housing insecurity and poor health outcomes. Yeah, I'm starting to come around on that one.
But it's even just reviewing, it's doing the research, it's getting the evidence together. Is it a viable option? Because right now it's not even an option. It's not even on the table. So it's not her super. And so as such, there could be tens of thousands of dollars there that could be really beneficial. And it could be done in a way that it's not open slather. It could be done that the court have the jurisdiction to grant it as part of the orders. I think that providing security for women and their children will also prevent the level of anxiety and angst that many young people face. We've got a school lawyer program, and we're doing a lot more work with young people, particularly around family violence. And they're often the hidden of the impact of family violence. And, if we can be putting or thinking about long-term strategies that support women and their children and the impact of separation, then to me it's like, I don't know, it's not rocket science, but why is it that we don't have enough long-term trauma recovery for women and their children? And ultimately then what we see is a whole level of angst for young people that ultimately can steer the direction of where they take their life, decisions that they make in life. So we need to be thinking much more creatively and outside the box around how we create what I kind of term is a straight line approach for women, rather than this higgledy-piggledy. I'd hate to see what a navigation map would look like for women experiencing family violence. It just wouldn't fit on a page because it would be just that difficult. And for me, it's like, how do we start to get that long-term thinking that give women a clear pathway and access to appropriate free services to generate or to provide that support as they work through. And let's remove the pressure on them having to make life-changing decisions. And, even if we can get the banks to review their hardship policy, that they give women time to be able to make these decisions rather than putting the pressure on that the house has to be sold because the mortgage has to be paid.
Yes, and what is the worst time to make a decision is when you're stressed out of your mind. Your capacity to take on cognitive load when you've got a million balls in the air and you're afraid is impossible.
And the natural human reaction is just to put your hands up and walk away. That's just a natural reaction. And so we don't want to see women walking away until they are fully informed and in a position to make that decision. But often for women experiencing family violence, they have not been allowed to be part of a decision process. That's been removed from them for a very long time. And so how do we then give them the confidence to be able to make those decisions. You can't then just pressure them to make those decisions. It takes a lot of trauma recovery work and to really work with them because they've lost aspiration. They've been in controlling relationships. We need to be able to provide a level of support that makes them feel confident enough to make those decisions.
Absolutely. I know from my own family's experience, and I've been open about this in different forums, that growing up in a household with coercive control, my mum told me about it, that after my parents separated, it probably took 5 or 6 years before she felt confident making decisions again. And it's not just at the point of it happening. The trauma is so long lasting. That loss of confidence, it sits with you for a really long time.
Yeah.
I can see the support in that situation being incredibly important.
And I think one of the things I kind of would like to just really quickly, because I know we've got to finish, but shared equity. One of the things in the shared equity is just being government rethinking how shared equity could work. I think we have a supply problem. So how could they redesign the guidelines where shared equity, where they could buy into the existing marital home rather than women having to sell up and move across? I just, again, think there's opportunities for us to think about. We have a supply problem we're not going to be able to build. There's existing supply. So how do we then shift our program thinking to ensure that buying into the marital home where obviously he needs to be paid out, the mortgage needs to be cleared under its current terms, but then transferred over, how, that could be an option. It's not the total answer, but again, could be a viable option rather than the woman having to sell and then looking at how does she purchase a property within the current guidelines when she's competing with first home buyers as well, which is driving up the prices of the lower end stock. So again, just thinking outside the box.
Yes. Yeah. And I do find it promising the way that the shared equity and home guarantee schemes have added a bit more flexibility.
Yeah.
And I note that they have eligibility if you have owned a home previously, but not in the last 10 years. And that there's different rules if you're a single parent as opposed to like a couple household. And there is some kind of movement in there. But I think a really targeted approach in this point of separation and this point of shared equity or the government coming in as a co-owner in a home purchase process, there's a lot of fertile ground there.
Yeah, there's a lot of fertile ground that, it would be great to explore. We certainly welcome that they have tweaked it. And, I think we've welcomed what they've tweaked, but I still think we could go a little bit further. That really ensures that at time of separation, she has a viable option and moving out of the marital home or selling it and then having to wait to see whether there's limited places. So that's problematic.
I have two final questions that I ask everyone that I just enjoy asking. And one of them is this question of vibing and venting, which is what's one thing that you're really vibing or excited about in gender and housing? And what's something you need to vent about?
Yeah, I think I'm generally excited that housing is actually on public opinion and, whether good or bad, that we're actually talking about it. So that's been a real positive. And I think we can continue to push and now that we're starting, we're seeing reports and we're seeing it coming from all angles. So I'm super pleased with that. Pleased that we could, but certainly, that the Victorian Legal Services Board saw some merit in what we were trying to achieve. So what we could achieve in Reach Her. And, when I look at individual clients, and it's not about the quantum of money that they obtain. It's the fact that often for a very long time, this is the first, and it's not the great terminology, but the first victory. It's the first time that someone's listened. And that is incredibly pleasing as, someone and, as an organisation that prides itself on protecting someone's rights. So that's what I'm super excited about. But then on the flip side, when I talk about the venting, is why is it that someone who's worked in the system for decades that we're still talking about, that it hasn't changed for women. It's probably with the current situation, it's probably got worse for women. On the TV this morning, there's the media talking about, how you can build granny flats in the back for your adult children. That's what it's got down to. More adult children are living at home because they can't enter the market. They can't even enter the private rental market. So that's quite concerning for me. I welcome that government's committing, but we are never going to build enough housing to house everyone. And so for me is, let's look at it as a combined, coordinated approach. And let's look at, there is a desperate or dire need for some sort of advisory organisation or group or something in which that women can come in and out of as they kind of work through the journey of family violence or separation, or and our vulnerable multicultural women, that there's somewhere that gives them independent financial advice with no obligation that they can then map out what the future could look like. And I just don't think there's enough there. They have to go to the banks themselves or to mortgage brokers rather than an independent women-led organisation that could provide that information. So, I'm a bit bemused as why we don't have that.
That hasn't happened. Yeah. Let's make that happen.
Yeah, that would be the ultimate, if we could get that, and that government recognise this and look at programs such as Reach Her, and where there are programs designed to think about a longer term strategy rather than short term.
Yeah, I love that. And final question is, if you could describe a genuinely gender equitable housing future, what would it look like? How would we know if we saw it?
I think seeing or having women informed so that women feel confident to make these decisions. We've kind of shifted the housing dial. We're now moving away from, house on a block of land now to, we've gone the complete opposite path now where it's all going to be apartment living. And it's like, well, have you actually thought about women and family needs there? If we're really truly around housing designed with a gender lens, then it's about a diversity. It's about looking at what are the diverse needs of women and then designing housing to match that. And that's where I think we have this system that the existing supply is not sufficient. And so what we're now doing based on economics is we're going to build these large multi-storey apartment blocks. Well, I'm not sure that they're absolutely suitable for women and children. And has women been consulted in that? I'm not sure they have. And so that's where, for me, that there'd be a future in which women were consulted in the design, that we get much more of a diverse housing stock, that if we are taking down existing properties, that we really think about what that could look like, who is the population, and then how do we design housing accordingly.
Yeah. That's such a good point. I did a project a couple of months ago looking at apartments in Moonee Valley, Marybeck, Darebin, so 3 of the northern Melbourne local government areas, and I was running the ABS statistics on the attributes of those apartments, and it was something like 93% of apartments in those 3 LGAs were either 1 or 2 bedrooms. And that's just apartments, right? There are also houses, but there is a reducing stock of that. But I just think just looking at apartment typologies, it's so homogenous blob. Like it's all the same. And then when we talk about diversity, that typology is appropriate for some people, absolutely.
Yeah.
But there is a diversity of needs and there is a diversity of households, and we're not really delivering that at the moment. There's been a real pendulum swing.
Yeah. And even, we work with a lot of our communities in which they have large families, and trying to find housing to match that. And often for women in their considerations, it's like they're looking to live near the kind of central business districts because they've got to look at childcare. They've got to look, how do I get the kids to school? I've got to get to work. Is there a public transport backup system? Like all of those women are practical thinkers, and that's what they're looking at. But the problem is that the closer they get into the central business districts of their suburbs or cities or towns, it's much more expensive. And now we've got planning in which government's now deciding that apartments is where we're going to go. And I'm not sure, how does a family of, 6 or 7 go in an apartment block? What happens with the family dog? And I think it plays an absolutely integral role. And I understand the economics of it. the cost of building's expensive, so you maximise the space, but it's not really taking into account what it is that women need and families need. And so are there going to be parkland for children to be able to access that? That's the issue for me. Who's designing them, and are they actually taking those things into account to ensure that it reflects the population, and particularly our women?
Yeah, interesting. The last thing I'll say on that is, again, just an anecdote that a very good friend of mine has 2 sons, and she's seeing someone and looking at moving in with him. He has 3 children, and she's joking with me. She's like, we have 5 kids. How will we 5 kids? Like, I don't even know. How will we make that happen? Like, it feels wild to me that I don't come across housing stock in my movements in the world very often that would fit a family of 7.
Yeah, and that's indicative of that we haven't done a lot of long-term thinking. All of the housing stock that's been built by developers, social housing, public housing has decreased. And as such, we're building social housing, but even our social housing now often is apartment style because of the cost. But again, how does that work?
Is it appropriate?
Is it appropriate? And, for me, it's like good planning means really looking at a suburb and looking at a kind of staggered approach. If you're going to go high rise, is looking at staggered approach so that you've got a kind of selection of 2, 4, 6 and high rise apartments, and then looking at, do we have sufficient for our larger families? Do we have sufficient parklands in our community to support apartment living? All of those things, and I'm just not sure who's got oversight of that. Which government department has oversight of thinking around those issues?
Yeah, I mean, there is departments who have oversight of that. Whether they're thinking from that lens is another thing entirely. But we could go down that rabbit hole for a really long time. I wrote my PhD on apartments and children, but I won't go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this
You're
conversation.
Welcome.
This has been such a valuable conversation. I really appreciate it.
Next week, I'll take a look at care and work practices through a gendered lens with Chifley Executive Director and former Executive Director of Per Capita, Emma Dawson. This series is a production of Per Capita, the independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community and social justice, and we are committed to providing ad-free and editorially independent content. This season is proudly sponsored by the YWCA and Australians Investing in Women, whose support helped produce the show and our research. Homes Not Houses was produced on the lands of the Wurundjeri-Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present.